Hello, everyone. This is Debra Richardson, and today I am putting the AP in Happy, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. This podcast will give a voice to accounts payable team members by talking about the growing reality of cyber attacks in their world and which vendor setup and vendor management techniques they can apply to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Need training? Visit the Vendor Process Training Center to enroll in your choice of weekly live and on-demand training sessions. Plus, get access to vendor setup form templates and reference tools that will help you and your team avoid fraud, fines, and bad vendor data. So sign up for a free account to get access to free training sessions, vendor process FAQs, and a resource library with information you need to manage your vendor master file. Visit training.debrarrichardson.com today. The link will be in the show notes. Isn't it frustrating when your vendor insists they gave you the right legal name and tax ID combination on their IRS Form W-9, but the combination does not match IRS TIN records? To get tips on how to enter the legal name for a match, keep listening. Welcome to episode 303, IRS Form W-9 series, IRS TIN matching tips based on vendor tax classifications. Now, I do have a slight confession. When I was a practitioner, and most of you, if you've been listening to my podcast episodes for a while, I've always or sometimes reiterated the fact that I was an accounts payable manager. So I was a practitioner and I had a team of 17, and we processed about 2,000 vendor requests per month. About half of them were new vendors, and we also maintained 140,000 active vendors across 7 different ERPs. So as you can imagine, that is a lot of W-9s that we received. And so whenever there was a new vendor or an existing vendor changed their tax ID, we had to go and do a TIN match. And those were like individual lookups. And that's really what I'm talking about today. And so we ran through some of these same issues. But again, I have a little confession to make. There's some of these tips that I'm giving you about the IRS TIN matching program that I didn't even know. And so had I known that, it probably would have saved us a bunch of back and forth with the vendors. But hopefully you can gain a couple of tips here that maybe you didn't know that will help you go forward as you deal with vendor setups and trying to validate their information. Now, I may do a separate podcast episode on the overview of the IRS TIN matching program. That's not what this is meant to be today. This is meant for you to use to add to your cheat sheet, to create a cheat sheet, to put in a reference guide, to add to your desktop procedures for how to enter in the legal name correctly. And for the most part, is based on tax classification from the W-9, but how to enter it in correctly in order to get a successful validation. And that's where it's really dependent upon you entering in the vendor legal name correctly. Now, this information comes from my training session that I have on the Vendor Process Training Center, and it is about how to accept your vendor's W-9, IRS Form W-9, because a lot of times they don't know how to submit or complete the W-9 correctly. And then what I found is that a lot of times my team didn't know if they had submitted or completed the W-9 correctly. And so I have a training session called IRS W-9 Examples by Tax Classification, what to look for when accepting from your vendor. And I will put that in the show notes if you're interested in it. But let's go ahead and get started with the tips. And these tips, by the way, came from publication 1220 from the IRS, and it talks all about the format of the 1099 file that you need to submit to the IRS for all your reportable vendors. But it talks about the name control, that one of the fields on the file that you need, and that matches, for the most part, the IRS TIN matching single lookup as well. And so this is where that comes from. And you can go on the irs.gov website and search for publication 1220. Now, they do update it every year. Usually it's around September, October, but usually the IRS TIN matching / name control, that information does not change. Okay, so the first one, and this is one that, again, I did not know as a practitioner, because as part of our vendor naming conventions, we would always drop the. So if there was a the in the vendor name, we would drop it and enter that vendor name on the vendor record. And vendor naming conventions are very critical, because if you don't have everyone putting in the vendor names the same way, you could end up with duplicate vendors, because with the example of someone could put in the Dream Factory and someone else can put in Dream Factory. And now if you try to find duplicates based on sort, you're never going to find it. So the though, and God, that sounds funny, but the IRS does allow but only when it is followed by one other word. So the example that they give in publication 1220 is the cafe. And so if you dropped the from the cafe and you try to do the TIN match, it is not going to match, because it's going to try to match on the first 4 letters, and the first 4 letters are not THEC, because it's only followed by one other word. So the name control TIN matching will be based on THEC in the cafe. So that was one. All right, now the next one is if you have like a healthcare provider, or maybe you're working with a vendor that is sending individuals out, like in healthcare situations for like a home health aide or something, and they give you the person's name, but on the W-9, but then they turn around and give you their EIN number. That happens a lot. So what you can do with that is just send it back to the W-9 back to them and ask for a social security number. And then you will find that more than likely the tax ID legal name combination will match IRS records. All right, so that was number 2. Now I have 2 more. So I guess a total of 4 today. So 2 more. All right, so the next one is for those vendors that selected partnership as their tax classification. And this is whether or not they selected partnership on that top line as just a partnership, or whether they selected it as part of the LLC and then put the P for partnership. And the tip is, if the EIN is assigned online, and you'll know that because the first 2 digits will be one of the following 2 digits. So 20, 26, 27, 45, 46, 47, 81, 82, 83, 84, 85, 87, 88, 89, 92, or 93. Then you'll use the first 4 characters of the primary name line. But if the EIN is not assigned online, meaning that the first 2 digits of their EIN does not match one of the first 2 digits I just listed, which was a lot, then you'll use the trade or business name of the partnership. All right, so that was the 3rd tip. And now for the 4th tip. Now, this is kind of the same thing as a partnership, but we're talking about trust and estate. But trust and estate is a little more complicated. So this has, I think, 1, 2, and then 3 based on the types of trusts. But let's go ahead and get started with that one. So the first tip, or the first part of the tip, is for estates. Now, for the IRS TIN match name control, you will use the first 4 characters of the last name of the decedent. The last name of the decedent must have the word estate after the first 4 characters in the primary name line. Now, for trusts and fiduciaries, for individual trusts, you'll use the first 4 characters of the individual's name. But for corporations that are set up as trusts, you'll use the first 4 characters of the corporate name. Now, here, we're going to talk about the EIN and if it's assigned online or not. So if it's assigned online, I'm going to repeat it again. It is a lot of numbers. The first 2 digits will be 20, 26, 27, 45, 46, 47, 81, 82, 83, 84, 85, 87, 88, 89, 92, or 93. Then you'll use the first 4 characters of the first name on the primary name line. Now, you have to remember to ignore the leading phrases such as trust for or irrevocable trust. But if the EIN is not assigned online for a trust or fiduciary account, use the name of the person in whose name the trust or fiduciary account is established. And that is the 4th tip, and I don't think I have any more. Oops, I spoke too soon. For those of you that stayed on, and you have to stay on my podcast to the end, because I think of things after that I didn't include initially because I didn't think there was anything to include for corporations. One, because it's a corporation is first 4 characters of the organization name, so that's easy enough. Same for nonprofits. But for the individual sole proprietor, there is something that can be a tip for you. So when you're entering in or using the vendor's name, if that name is hyphenated and you keep having trouble trying to do the IRS TIN match, the rule is when an individual's 2 last names are hyphenated, you'll use the first 4 characters of the first last name. So that's how you do the TIN match. That was the last and bonus tip that I forgot to say. And so I hope you found at least 1 or 2 helpful tips that'll help you get that IRS TIN match as a valid TIN match and not have to go back to the vendor. All right, so that is it for today. Thanks, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the 303rd episode of the Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy.